Good evening, everyone, and welcome to NAIT's Alumni Lifelong Learning event, Landscaping in Alberta, How to Plan Your Landscape, presented by Avery Armstrong. As is our tradition at NAIT, we honor and acknowledge that the land on which we learn, work, and live is Treaty 6 territory. Sorry, folks. We seek to learn from the history and the lessons that have come before us and to draw on the wisdom of the first peoples in Canada. Only through learning can we move forward in truth and reconciliation and to a better future together. My name is Tammy Carrero, and I'm the Alumni Relations Coordinator at NAIT, and I'm a proud NAIT grad. And I'm here tonight, and I'm going to serve as your host. Before we get started, there are a few housekeeping items. The presentation will be recorded. Upon entry, your microphone was automatically muted. However, we encourage you to turn on your video so we can see you. We encourage you to share your key takeaways on social media. Be sure to tag us so we can reshare. Please use the chat feature or raise your hand. Questions will be addressed throughout the presentation. As NAIT alumni, you're automatically members of the NAIT Alumni Association. The Alumni Association has benefits like today's event and other events, discounts, and services. Today's event is sponsored by our Affinity Program partner, TD Insurance, Melosh Monix. As alumni, receive preferred rates on TD Home and auto insurance. For more information, visit the alumni website at nait.ca/alumni. Now let's meet our presenter. Avery is a graduate of the Landscape Architecture program at NAIT. She is a Landscape Architecture Technologist, Master Gardener, and a super plant enthusiast. She works as a landscape designer for Salisbury Landscape and has experience with city parks, tree nurseries, computer drafting, project management, and gardening. Welcome, Avery.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Tammy. I am going to share my screen and start the presentation. Here we go. Okay, we're going. So thank you, Tammy, for the introduction. My name is Avery, landscape designer. I do have a few points in the presentation where I'd love to chat in the future or as a conversation. I'll have little prompts, but also you're always welcome to have comments in the chat. Tammy will help me continue the conversation. So today's presentation is how to plan your landscape. So the whole idea of this presentation is all of the thoughts and documents you need to gather before you start designing. It's not just about like going to the greenhouse and picking out what's cute, even though that's super fun. There's a lot of thought and organization that needs to go into making sure that your garden or your landscape project goes smoothly and it will last. First things first, I'm Avery. I'm a landscape architect technologist. I'm an organic master gardener. I'm a landscape designer over in Sherwood Park, and I'm also a plant nerd. So kind of all comes together. Our topics for today, I try to organize it into different sections to sort of collect our thoughts because there's a lot of things to think about when you're planning a landscape. I do this how many times a day designing people's yards. So it's a lot of things to think about. So it's good to like have it organized. First things first, we'll go over all the documents you need, legal stuff, bylaw stuff, house stuff, in order to make sure that you're being accurate and you're following code. Number two is thinking about what kind of landscape elements you want to put in the yard. So patios, paths, green spaces, planting beds, why are we putting there? Where are we putting them? Third topic would be the design styles. So these are the themes that we're looking for. If there's any color palettes you're more interested in sort of figuring out what it is there. We're going to go through plant choices, how to choose the right plants. And the scariest thing is the budget, is how to budget for a landscape project, whether you're doing it yourself or you're getting it done professionally. So we have about an hour. Once again, please put comments in the chat, but also I'll be open to conversation throughout the presentation. So the first thing, pre-planning, all the documents, super important, super boring. There is a whole bunch of things you need to collect before you start your landscape project. As a landscape designer, I need to focus on some of the more technical stuff because I represent a company and I have to do it professionally. Doing it yourself, obviously, there'd be a different degree of documents you need to collect. So the first one I always would advocate to have is something called your RPR, which is your real property report. This is a document that contains dimensions of your house, maybe contains elevation, where your property line ends, where your fence ends. It's just good to know the limits of your property. It can also be important to know if you might think you own a part of your land, but you might not. So that will dictate what you're allowed to build on it. RPRs just help me be accurate. Another piece of documentation that can always be great when starting a landscape project is called a plot plan or maybe an elevation plan. This may be combined with an RPR, kind of like this one here. But this contains elevation numbers, heights for your project. So as a professional landscape designer, I would use this to calculate the heights of retaining walls or wing walls or second story patios, things, you know, where I need to know the total elevations. If you're doing it yourself, you can usually just eyeball it. Depends. Another important thing to know is if you do live in a neighborhood, especially some of the newer developments, you might have a homeowners association or like a neighborhood landscape requirement package. This may dictate what kind of mulch colors you're allowed to use, what kind of plants you're allowed to use, what kind of fence styles you're allowed to have. And if you don't follow these, you could either get fined or lose a deposit, like your landscape deposit on your new house. So these are really important to know if you have like a new build and you're trying to get your landscaping done. You do not want to anger your homeowners association. Another important thing to think about, not quite documents, but some like the legal stuff before you get started, is the city bylaws you might want to think about. There are a few building codes and permits you might need when building. They're all on the City of Edmonton website, and calling 311 is usually a good way to get information about those if you have questions. Still with city stuff, it's good to know your zoning area if you know what like part of the city you're in. If you're classified as like a residential zone or you're maybe the downtown core, if you're like a multi-use, multi-housing unit, there might be different zoning bylaws about what you're allowed to put where, how far into your property you're allowed to build things, if there's planting requirements, that kind of stuff. Good to know. You don't want the city coming by or having issues. On the City of Edmonton website, especially for new builds, they are heavily suggesting, as in mandatory, these planting requirements. So if you got a new build or you tore down your old house and you're doing a rebuild on the same lot, whether that's an infill or just like a reno new build, you will need to follow the planting requirements. So it's good to know how many plants you have to put in to make your lot finished. So it's all on the City of Edmonton website. You could just check what kind of neighborhood you're in, the size of your lot, and then you can tell how many plants that you need. It's usually pretty easy. It's like 1 tree, 2 trees, a few shrubs. That's easy enough for most yards. The last thing to know, sort of thinking about your site before we start doing the fun design stuff, is understanding your site. So I would argue that you think about your landscaping for like a year before you want it to start. It's good to, for a year, just watch the yard, sort of see how the sun travels across it, where it feels windy, where it always puddles, where it feels dry, if bugs go to that corner a lot, if dogs are always peeing on that one part of the yard, just sort of like understanding your space, because you don't want to build something and then have that not be the right space later. And always site measurements, site photos, just making sure you understand the scale of your space. If you have your RPR, you probably have a lot of these measurements already. Now we get into the fun stuff. We can start designing. So we understand our site. We understand what we're allowed to build. We have all of our permits ready, not filled out because we don't know we're designing yet, but ready. And then we can start designing. So these are all your landscape elements, as I call them. These are the ideas of how are we going to use our space? Because that's the most important question. You don't want to just be like, oh, well, I see everyone puts a patio in their backyard, so I'm going to put a patio in my backyard. Okay, well, will you use it? Why will you use it? Who's going to use it? When are you going to use it? You want to be thinking about all these things so your backyard gets appreciated properly, but you're also just not wasting money on things that you think you should have, but you don't really know why you're putting them in there. So some of the main questions you could be asking when thinking about how you want to organize your space would be, when will you use the space? Are you looking for a summer only space? Totally great. You only want to use it when it's nice outside, super fair. Some people want more of like a 3-season space. So maybe there's a little bit of shelter going on. You want to go in the winters, maybe have fires in the fall, like just when you want to use the space, like how much are we willing to invest it if you're being out there year round? Who is going to use the space? Do you have kids? They probably need room to run around. They're probably going to ruin things. They might put things in their mouth that they shouldn't. This will dictate what we do with our space. If you've got pets, same thing. I've got a dog that pees on absolutely everything. So I have to think about that a lot when I'm doing landscaping. This is my little menace right here in the photo. I'm looking innocent, but he is probably up to mischief. And then what are you going to do in the space? Are you a retired couple? All you want to do is read in the backyard, do a little bit of gardening. Do you have like huge parties and like everyone comes out? You have like a fire pit and there's people walking around everywhere. Or are you just like cooking for your family? Do you have a few people over? You want to know what you're doing with the space, because that'll dictate the size of the space, the materials that you use, all sorts of things. So I think there's like 3 mainish landscape elements. The first one would be your paved areas. So that's like patios and paths. You also have your sodded areas. So that could be like sod or turf, and that's sort of like your green lawn areas. And then there would be the beds. So whether you have planting there or if it's just a mulch bed, sort of figuring out these spaces and where we'd want to put them. So the main reason I'm putting in pavers usually is for a main walkway. So I classify like a main walkway or a primary walkway as an area where we are getting from point A, going to point B. It's not leisurely, it's not fun, it's direct. We're carrying our groceries, we're walking our dog, we're parking our car, trying not to freeze our butt off and get inside, you know? So this is the main reason I'm putting in walkways, and the main reason people put in walkways. So when you're putting in a main walkway, you want to be thinking about things that are easy to maintain, easy to shovel, easy to walk on. If it's a main walkway, you're going to be walking on there in the winter with your hands full of groceries. You don't want to slip, you don't want to trip, you don't want to fall. It has to be easy to take care of. So you want something that's level and smooth and pretty simple. So investing the most amount in making the main walkway accessible is the most important thing. Direct access to points, just try to go through. So this is usually, to the front of the house, or for people with detached garages, from the garage to your back door. Get inside. Another way you could put in a path in some yards would be like a secondary access path. So this would be thinking about paths in the garden that it doesn't really matter if they take a little bit of time. Maybe they're just to walk on for fun. Maybe they're just doing a little lap around your beds. Maybe they're going to your compost bin. I don't know, maybe they're going to your back gate. So they don't need to be quite as accessible. They could be a little bit more spaced out. You can have a little bit more fun with materials like stepping stones if you want, because they don't need to be accessible maybe year round or as frequently. Because it is a secondary path, you could always think that it might not need to take as much of the budget. So don't worry too much about that. At the same time, even with a secondary path, it's fun to like have this like cute meandering stepstone path going through your shrubs, but you don't want to make it too crowded that eventually it overgrows and you lose your path in the shrubs. Another reason you might want to do something with your yard would be a fire pit. A lot of people ask for these, obviously. So thinking about, once again, what we talked about, like, when do I want to use the fire pit? Who's going to use the fire pit? How often am I going to use the fire pit? Do I really want one, or does just everyone have one? So thinking for you, like, it's your space. It has to match how you're living, right? So when designing a fire pit, you want to think about, there's a few practical things, obviously. Material choice. You don't want it to stain. So there might be charcoal or ashes or s'mores or wine or chocolate being spilled. You want to think about a material that's maybe a little bit darker that can handle that kind of abuse. You want to be aware of, obviously, fire pit code. They're supposed to be 10 foot away from flammable surfaces, according to City of Edmonton. So that's like 20-foot wide, almost patio right there, just for a safe zone. Not all fire pits and patios are rated for heat, if that sounds weird. So just making sure that you're aware of that. Fire gets hot and whatever around it will get hot, and it has to handle that. I would argue, for accessibility reasons, that fire pits should be level. I don't like them on rock crush or like mulch or pebbles. I think that's a tripping hazard. I'd worry that you back up your seat, someone falls over, someone trips. No good. I want fire pits to be level, flat, safe, no tripping, easy access, and lots of backup room. So when someone scoots out their chair to like go get another s'more, they're not going to fall over or trip onto something. So I have a little thing here. Still got a bit of time. But if you want to put a comment in the chat, why would you put in a patio? What is your favorite way to use a patio? I have a deck, which is kind of a cheat. So which I kind of treat that as my patio. And my favorite thing to do on there is just read and basically just pet my dog. That's what I think about basically every day when I get home, is like, can I go outside yet? Another use for paved areas, which you might want to think about putting into your yard, are entertaining areas. So these would be areas mainly for like dining tables or outdoor eating, if you have an outdoor kitchen. Once again, thinking about material choices, you'd want to choose a material that doesn't stain when food drops. Once again, wine, hard to get out of things. Level, once again, backing a chair up. You want it level for your patio chairs and the feet to be level. But also when thinking about eating and entertaining areas, you might want to think about what degree of sunlight is coming into the area. If you are like a cold-blooded lizard like me who loves the sun, I always want to be in the sun. Some people get really hot. You might want to think about your eating area in the shade. You also want to think about how it affects the materials you're choosing. Really dark stones, kind of like ones in my picture here, can get kind of toasty at the end of the day for walking on. So you just want to be mindful about what kind of materials you're using, where you're putting the patio, who's going to be using it, are they barefoot? The next major landscape element that you can put in your yard is your green lawn spaces. So the two main options are probably sod and artificial turf. Once again, you want to be asking yourself, what is the question of what are we using this yard for? Why are we putting in a lawn area? Because we should. I have a lot of people asking to rip out their lawns and do something else. So if you don't like lawns or you just think you should, don't do it. Do something else. Do native plants. That's so much more fun. But if you've got kids or dogs or you need somewhere to run around, a lawn is great. So here are the two options. Sod, main option. You see this a lot. People think sod is one of the easiest to maintain things, but if you think of it, it's like a giant plant that needs you to water it and fertilize it and aerate it and cut it and mow it and whippersnip it, and that's a lot of work. So how much maintenance are you willing to invest? Do you want to be out there once or twice a week? You want to think about if you've got kids or pets in the area. Obviously, if you're putting like a play place and a kid's going to fall off it, sod is a lot softer to land in. That makes sense. Some people might want to think about if they've got allergies to pollen. That could dictate what kind of plants or sod you're putting in. Sod does have the lowest upfront cost to install. I would argue the cost of maintenance can be quite high, both just the time it takes and the money it takes to maintain it. But that's my opinion. I'm not a sod girl. I like plants. But also when you're trying to find a location for sod in the yard, you want to be thinking about if that's an actual suitable place for sod as a plant to grow. If it's too sloped of a yard, if it's like a walkout basement ramp, too sloped, too sunny, too shady, too wet, too dry. Sod might have a hard time, and you might want to think about other options. A second option to a green space would probably be turf. So it's sort of the same questions as sod, but just with different answers. So how much maintenance? Almost none. Turf is good for areas of either pretty high traffic or areas that you don't want to ever have to think about. So it's good for areas like dog runs, sports areas, underneath play structures where the other things won't grow. But it's also good in areas where it's really hard to get maintenance to. Like in this yard, it's like a walkout basement. There's no shed back here. How are we going to mow this? We're going to like bring the mower through the house? No. So let's do turf. A little bit easier to maintain. There is a higher upfront cost, but the maintenance of it is almost zero. So one thing you might want to think about what's for you. The last main element would probably be mulch. Good. Okay. Mulch is sort of all the areas in between, whether they've got planting or not, or it's just sort of like a decorative ground cover. I personally don't like putting a lot of lawn down. I put a lot of mulch down. I just think it looks neater. I think it's easier to maintain. The first option is probably wood mulch. This is what I like to put down in my own yard, hence my dog. It's good. You want to think about where you're putting mulch on areas of slopes. It can roll down slopes if it's a very aggressive slope, so you want to be thinking about the slopes in your yard. You can get your slope information about your yard from your plot and elevation plan. Going back to that. When you're thinking about your wood mulch, you have to think again, who is using the yard? Do you have a dog? Do you have children? Will they roll on it? Will they try to eat it? Might not be the option for you, but the other option might be rocks, and I don't know if you want your dog eating rocks. For new developments where there's not a lot of construction, I don't always advocate for wood mulch because there's not a lot of buildings nearby and it can get quite windy, like a little wind tunnel, and bark mulch has a tendency to blow away in the wind or roll onto the sidewalk. Kind of want to think about what kind of neighborhood you're in. It's also important to think about the amount of plants that you want to be putting in your mulched bed areas. I would argue that wood mulch is better for plant health. So if you're doing a lot of plants or highly dense planting, I would argue for wood mulch. You want to think about the investment cost, just like with sod and turf. Wood mulch is a lot more budget friendly. There is a little bit of topping up to do over the years, but I would say, someone has a question. What type of mulch? Cedar, wood, or other? We use a cedar wood mulch at my work. There's lots of different types. It's totally up to you. That one's my favorite. We kind of use like a semi-shredded version. I think it mats together over time a little bit better than the big bark chips, so I kind of prefer it. Some people like the dyed wood mulch, and it can look really cool. It's like a nice accent pop. But they can die in the sun over time and kind of just look a little faded and dated. So you'd kind of have to like keep topping that up. But pretty much any wood mulch, I would say, is probably the best for plant health. It's just depends on the area. I like to lay my mulch really thick. In my backyard, I laid it like a foot thick because I don't want to mess around with weeding. So the fluffier, the better. When it's really fluffy and thick, it's all air pockets. It's so much harder for weeds to take root, like quackgrass. So it's a lot less weeding, in my opinion. The other main option for ground covers would probably be rocks, which I count as a ground cover. So when thinking about if you want to put rocks in your yard, you can ask the same kind of questions. What is the slope to the yard? If you do have quite a sloped yard, like in the picture here, which is another walkout basement, it's probably like 10 foot from the back door to the back gate. So there's quite a drop. I chose rock mulch for this backyard. It's a 40 millimeter Rundle jagged rock mulch. And I chose them because they're kind of sharp-ish. So the sharpness of them nestle into each other and they're not as prone as rolling down the hill as like little round stones. like even like a pea gravel. So you want to think about the slope of your yard, what's going to stick to that slope. The worst thing would be like a good rainfall and just like half your yard goes away, right? You want to think about if you're putting rocks, who in the yard is going to be using. If there's children running around, you don't want them to fall into that. My dog would try to eat it because he's dumb. So I don't have a lot of rocks in my yard. I would argue rock mulch is not the best for highly densely planted areas. So if you are a super plant lover, it's pretty hard to keep rock mulch clean. Any leaf litter that falls in the rock mulch, you got to be on it, because if that settles, you're just making a little weed farm. Obviously quackgrass, like a quackgrass dandelion farm. So you have to be on it. It can look very clean, but as soon as it goes awry, it's gone. I read once on the City of Edmonton suggested landscaping techniques that rocks are good within the first few feet of the house because of their fireproof abilities. I don't know if a lot of people think about that when they're designing landscaping, but I thought that was an interesting tidbit. That makes sense. It's harder to light a rock on fire. At the same time, if you have an extremely hot area and you want a densely planted area, rocks can really hold on to the heat of the sun, and it can crisp plants around the edges. So you have to think about your site. And just keeping them contained. Rocks can also roll onto sidewalks. You have to think about what kind of rock you're using, if it's next to a main path, if it's windy. All right, now we go on to another fun part, design styles. So I think the most important thing about design styles is not what's trending, because I don't really follow that. I have to because it's my job, but like I don't personally like it. And the design style for you is one that you like. So you should go out and figure out what you like, because it's your house, it's your yard, you should enjoy it. A few ways that I gain inspiration would probably be Pinterest or articles on the internet. Catalogs, I get a lot of seed catalogs, landscape magazines, I love going through those. But mainly just out on a walk, driving around, figuring out what you like and what you don't like. Get inspiration online. I got my Pinterest all organized, figuring out ideas. Or you can go on walks. I walk my dog every day. Always judging everyone's landscaping, getting ideas. When choosing a style for your yard, so we've talked a little bit about how we're going to use the yard, when we're going to use the yard, who's going to use the yard, what elements we want to put in the yard. But with those three elements, there's an infinite possibility of how we can arrange them or style them. So how do we figure what we want? How do we figure what we like? When choosing a style, it's important for, choosing a style that you think looks nice, obviously aesthetic, but it's also important functionally, because certain styles have different functions. So when choosing a style, you want to think about that style. Is it more drawn towards a certain type and color of planting? So like a cottage garden, lots of colors, lots of textures, lots of maintenance, maybe not for you. When choosing a style, you want to think about the size, shape, and the color. The materials are frequently used in that style. So like hyper modern is a lot of like blacks, grays, very sharp colors. If your house isn't quite that style, your neighborhood isn't quite that style, it might contrast, and contrast is fun if that's what you're going for. But if you're going for something that complements a little bit more, you just want to think about what's usually used in that style and if it's the right space for you. You want to think about the line work and style. Once again, hyper modern, a lot of straight lines, very intentional. I'm more of a loosey-goosey person myself, so my garden is very loosey-goosey. There's lots of swoops, there's lots of curves, there's kind of beds and plants everywhere. It kind of matches my personality and my preferred level of maintenance, and I don't mind gardening, so I have relatively high maintenance yard. When choosing a style, you want to think about the size of the yard you have and the density of what you'd like it to be. Some styles, like English cottage, are really dense and really busy, and if that's just not going to go with your yard, that might not be the right style for you. Level of maintenance, like I touched on. Different styles can come with any amount of maintenance you want them to. Some of them are more prone to more plants. Usually more plants means more maintenance. More sod can mean more maintenance. Someone made a comment about if they can have a copy of this presentation. That is up to Tammy. If you're talking about like the boxes, these, someone's talking about the boxes. This is just a picture of my Pinterest page. I could probably share that later if you'd like, if that's what you were talking about. Okay, cool. Choosing a style, and I kind of touched on this, you want to think about the architecture of the house and the neighborhood. It's totally up to you. If you want to complement your house or contrast the house, that's super fun. Doesn't matter. I do personally like to reflect the architecture of the house, so it doesn't look so out of whack. But you just want to think about these things. So I have another little pop-up, a little thinker for you. What's another factor that would help you choose a style? Oh, someone had a comment. We encountered many styles that complement. Oh, the chat went away. Tammy.
Can you see it, Avery, or no?
No, I can't see it. It went somewhere else.
Okay. So it's from Richard. He's asking, have you encountered many styles that complement a natural area surrounding the yard? For example, similar shrubs or trees in yard as nearby green space.
Yes. So I do come into that, like the picture that I showed earlier with like the rocks on the hill. They had a ravine at the back of their house, so I do try to take that into account when I'm designing. Obviously the primary factor is like what you want, what the client wants. But I do try to keep that in mind about surrounding areas as well. Both for the fact that the ravine might intrude on my landscaping at some point, because ravines are like that. So I try to respect and like leave a view to the ravine, the natural areas, so you can like respect the view, but also keep the planting close to the like sort of more natural plants if it's near a ravine, because I want it to kind of flow. But that's once again totally up to the client what kind of style. If they told me they want hyper modern, they want it to be like a sharp end to the yard and then natural area, then that's what they want. And that's the answer. I usually try to blend things a little bit more. I'm more natural, but it's totally up to what people want. So we can go through a few styles that I'm frequently asked about, and sort of how to implement them. First one would be cottage garden. So like English gardens, lots of plants. This one's probably my favorite. Unfortunately, I don't get to do this one a lot because they are very high maintenance and a lot of people are very busy and they don't want to maintain their yard all the time, which I respect. So this one is usually like a lot of swooping lines, not very intentionally placed things, even though they are intentional, but they don't look intentional. A lot of colors, usually more towards like the pinks and the purples. Lots of perennials, lots of flowers, lots of bumblebees. Another style you might want to get inspired by would be what I call modern. People call modern different things, whatever. To me, it means intentional lines, clean shapes, usually straight lines, symmetrical, balanced, organized, minimal planting, bold colors. Everything is like making a statement. Like your eye doesn't get lost anywhere, like it knows where it's going. So I do get modern a lot. I try to match it to the houses that I have. I do get a lot of like infills, like those little skinny homes, and they are usually hyper modern. So I have to go kind of the modern style with them. You can use whatever style you want for whatever kind of lifestyle or house you have. It doesn't matter. They just come with different vibes and sometimes different levels of maintenance. Modern, I tend not to plant as heavy. As you can kind of see in these, I do tend to use more foliage interest plants rather than like flowering interest. So maybe more evergreens, more interesting foliage deciduous. just as not too much maintenance, but it doesn't take any attention away from usually the hardscapes, which are the accent. Another style we've got here, I would call natural style. So this kind of like cottage garden, not super intentional looking, more raw edges to rocks, maybe natural boulders, wildflowers, native plants, all very natural tones and hues of the colors. Nothing's too vibrant. Everything's kind of soft. You could pair this with like an alpine or like mountain style if you wanted, like kind of like the streets of Canmore. Just very earthy, simple. This can be easy to maintain in its own way. If you're planting a lot of wildflowers and native plants, they're usually pretty easy growing because they're native, right? They don't need a whole lot of extra fuss. So they can be pretty easy. Another one that's not quite as trending right now would be, I would call the traditional style. This is usually sort of like big swoops, soft planting, planting near the house to help sort of soften the facade of it, accent boulders, wood mulch. It just fits in the landscaping. It fits in the neighborhood. It's not like an eye-popping accent. It's not making a statement. It looks nice. It's clean. It's easy to maintain. You can plant in it. It's just pretty simple. It gets the job done, which is sometimes all we need. The next thing when thinking about planning our landscaping is what plants do we want? This is my favorite part. So, how do you choose a plant? There's a few factors when choosing a plant, and I'll go through these in more detail. First one is it hardy? So we can go through hardiness in a bit, but will it actually grow in this climate of Edmonton, Alberta, or your backyard? Is it fit for the microclimate that you want to put it in the yard? Number two, which I'd argue is pretty important, is do you like the look of it? Do you like the look of it when it's mature throughout all its seasons, throughout some of its growing season? You also want to think about, if you're planning a full landscape, how the plants interact with each other. So design-wise, you want to have a little bit of design interest. And when putting things in your garden, obviously they will be interacted with by others and by nature. So how was that plant going to exist in your yard? So the first thing, and probably the most important, is the plant hardy and site appropriate? So there's this thing called the plant hardiness zone, which is much debated exactly what zone we are. I'd argue we're somewhere around a 3B. So this relates to the amount of overnight temperatures that are lower than -40 consecutively, or something like that. So the Arctic is a 0, and then the equator is a 12. And we're around a 3B, so we're pretty close to the equator. So when choosing a plant, you want something that's obviously hardy enough that it can handle our winters. Pretty much anything you can find in greenhouses should be hardy. They don't really sell things that aren't. But you'd also want to choose something that is appropriate to your site. So if you go to a good garden center, there'd be lots of garden staff there to help you understand the plant labels and understand the plant needs. Some of them are more sunny or part shade or full shade. Some of them like to be more moist. Some of them like to be more dry. Some of them don't mind snow being dumped on them or kids running across them. Some of them are more prone to different diseases that you might want to know about. So these are all good things to think about when putting a plant in your yard and what space it's going into. When choosing plants, you also want to think about the level of maintenance for that exact plant. I would argue most plants aren't super high maintenance if they're hardy. I would love to plant hardy plants because I think if I have to coddle a plant too much, then it doesn't need to be here, because I want plants that want to be here. So most of my maintenance is just a little bit of deadheading, a little bit of perennial cutback, maybe some pruning to shape, not too much. You'd also want to think about, in the site you're putting it at, once again, the moisture levels, the level of maintenance you want to put into it, and sort of the sunniness of the area. So there's no point choosing a plant that you think is cute, but it won't live in the place that you want to put it, unfortunately. Much to my chagrin, because I keep trying. The next thing to think about when trying to pick up plants is, do you like it? You want to like the shape of it, the color of it. I mean, you have to like it if you're putting it in your yard, right? Like, don't just put in a shrub because you needed to put a shrub in your yard. Like, you have to think it's nice. I only like to put things in my yard that make me happy. And I try to grow things that shouldn't grow here all the time. And I'm doing okay. I've got some ginkgos in my yard, which don't grow here, but I got one. I've got cacti in my yard, which kind of grow here, but I'm working on it. But they make me happy because I like gardening. When choosing plants for your space, you want to think about the elements of design. So this is like designer brain going off here. You want to think about how you're using height and width in different styles. They use height and width in different ways. Maybe you want like smooth, level, consecutive, even rows for a modern style. Maybe you want varying heights and widths for an English cottage because it gives you more interest. You want to think, oh, thank you. I love my ginkgo. I'm reading the chats while we're going. You want to think about the form and the shape of the growing habit of the plant. So you can think about maybe the growing habit of the trees, if they're columnar, if they're fat, if they're round, thinking about the shape of the leaves, how they fit into the space. It's also good maybe to get a variety of color. I usually try to get a variety of color because I prefer the more garden style. So thinking about color through the seasons, maybe things going off in spring and then summer, and then you have fall colors. There's winter interest. But maybe you don't want that. Maybe you're more simplistic minimalist style and you want everything the same color, everything's even, and it all matches. That's great. And you might want to think about texture. So texture of the leaves, the shape of the leaves, the overall feeling of the plant. Like, is it a very airy, fluffy tree? Is it a really thick, dense evergreen? How do they interact with each other? So I have some examples. So an example of, height and width would be like a columnar tree. Nothing is the right answer in design. Everything is always what you want it to be. I think a variety of textures, colors, heights is interesting. I think it creates more interest in a yard. Kind of doesn't make your eyes glaze over if everything matches, but that's just my opinion. Growing habit types. You could have like creepers or like little gumdrop shaped shrubbies. You can have tall things. You can have big fluffy things, creates more interest. You want to think about the color of the garden. You can create color through foliage types like this 9-bark, through flower colors, through bright red fall colors like maples, through different colors of evergreens, and the textures. Just thinking about the different shapes and sizes of leaves and if it creates more visual interest to the yard. You'd also, when putting plants in your yard, want to think about how they're going to be interacted with. So you might want to put edibles in the yard. So like edible berries or fruit trees, that's awesome. If you've got like little ones who love eating apples, that's super fun. But at the same time, if you've got pets, you want to think about what's in the yard that maybe isn't good for them. There's a lot of things that are poisonous out there to cats and dogs. So you want to be mindful of what you're putting in your garden. If you've got a dog that likes to eat things in your backyard, like mine does, he eats all my Saskatoons before I can get to them. You want to think about who else might interact with your yard, like wildlife. So I plant a lot of bee-friendly things because I love the bumblebees. Maybe if you're allergic to pollen or bumblebees, don't put as many flowers in your yard. And I do get that comment sometimes. But also like bunnies, deer, birds. If you want them there or if you don't want them there, that'll dictate the kind of plants you're putting in your yard. And if there's any other way you want to interact with your yard, other than maintenance, obviously. But I like to press flowers. I like to make cards. I like to make bouquets. I like to give seeds as gifts. So I'm always working in my yard and interacting with it in different ways. So let's chat comment. What do you think is one of the most important factors when choosing a plant? There may or may not be a right answer that I talked about, but it's also your opinion. Non-invasive, that is also a very good point. Yes, that's a very good point. So I guess I can kind of tie into site appropriate because you don't want it to be invasive. Hopefully if you're getting it from a garden center, it's not an invasive plant, hopefully. Here's a picture of me planting a landscape. I always do a detailed planting plan that's to scale for my clients, and then I never follow it. I always go to site and I move everything around and I make my foreman mad at me. But that's why I'm at site doing it myself. I don't tell anyone else what to do. I put everything down myself. So this yard was like all native grasses. I've got yarrow. I have got crocus in there. It's going to be just this like billowing field of native grasses and flowers, and it's going to be so beautiful. I'm so excited. And the last topic when planning your landscape is thinking about the budget. Super scary. What do you spend on a landscape project? Well, it's totally up to you how much you feel like spending. If you do parts yourself, if you hire a professional. I usually tell people when they're feeling overwhelmed about budget to start thinking that maybe 10 to 25% of your home's value is a good starting place. So that could be if you're getting landscaping fresh. So you got a new build, it's all mud, but you want a deck and you want a patio and you need a fence and you need sod and you need planting beds. That's a good chunk of change right there. If you're just doing a renovation, it could be anything. I have projects from like 5,000 to 300,000. So it could be anywhere, right? It's totally what you're looking for. When budgeting, you want to think about investing in elements that maybe would bring you return on investment. So some people want to landscape for more curb appeal. So when they do sell their home eventually, it's a bit easier to maintain for the new owners. You can look into doing that. Or you can just invest in elements that you're going to spend a lot of time on and that are really worth it to you. So I just dropped a good chunk of change on making a new veggie bed for myself because I'm going to be out there a lot. And that's what makes me happy. So just invest in spaces that you're actually going to use and that make you happy. How far apart should you put plants? And is space more attractive? How far apart you should put plants is totally dependent on the plant that you're planting. I would argue that plants shouldn't touch a whole lot. Maybe with like perennials and wildflowers, they can like kind of touch and create like a mass of flowers. But for shrubbies and for trees, I don't like them touching. It's just like overcrowding when like you're at West Edmonton Mall. It's just more room for disease and germs, and they can't breathe properly, right? So letting a little bit of room between your plants first for proper airflow kind of helps prevent disease and fungal infections, and just everyone is a lot more healthy. So when spacing plants, you want to think about the plant's mature size. So not the size you buy it at the nursery where it's like a little baby. Trees can get to 50 feet tall, so you want to think about its mature size. I did have a little question down here. Has anyone ever gotten any professional landscaping done? How did it go? Did you learn anything from it? Was it worth it? Did you do parts yourself? So that kind of brings us to the idea of when planning your landscape, there's a lot of things to consider before you even, put a shovel in the earth. You want to obviously follow the rules. You want to get all the permits, understand the bylaws, understand the space. I'm going to answer questions in a sec. You want to think about how you want to use the yard, things you want to put in the yard. You want to think about the styles and the colors you like that you're more drawn towards. Think about the plants you want to put into it. And then you want to think about how much you're willing to invest in this project, because obviously that's a really big factor. And here are some of my favorite projects that require a lot of thinking and they require a lot of planting. So last year I created this labyrinth in someone's yard. It's all planted with native wildflowers. So I'm hoping within a few years it'll just be this like colorful rainbow of circles. It'll be beautiful. They're gonna put like a little bench in the middle. It's gonna be super fun. I hope they invite me back to their yard so I can walk it. I also created a yard that was fully edible last year, all edible shrubs and berries and perennials, with a spot for chickens. Never really designed a chicken yard before. And I like when clients add little personal touches, make room for, kindergarten trees or inuksuks or birdhouses that they made, and just like little bits. And that's it. So I'm going to see if I can stop sharing and answer some questions. How soon can you plant a tree after digging out a tree from black rot? Do you mean black rot or black knot? Because I had a tree with black knot in my front yard that I took out 4 years ago, and it is still suckering. I planted a tree close to ish where it was. Obviously you can't plant a tree exactly where the old tree was because there are big stump and roots in the way. But I don't know, I did it because I wanted a tree there, so I put one there, close-ish. A different species than the one that got black knot though, so they don't contaminate each other. Someone else said, do I have a website and email address? I don't have a website, but I do have an email address if Tammy can find a way to share it. Cool. I'm going to self-promote, but I work at Salisbury Landscaping. So if anyone ever has any questions about landscaping or gardening, that's where I am. If you go on the Salisbury Landscaping website, my face is on the website there. You can click it and email me there too.
Sorry, Avery, do you want me to share your personal, your Gmail, or your Salisbury?
Oh, yeah, the Salisbury one would be good because that's like landscape focused. Thank you. Does anyone have any questions about gardening, landscaping, trees? Someone says most examples of landscape are not in zone 3 on any websites. Where can we find pictures? That's true. It's really hard. Like when I'm showing clients plant photos, whenever you type in like whatever mountain ash, it's never an Albertan looking mountain ash. It's some gorgeous thing in BC, right? So finding accurate pictures of what things actually look like in our zone, I would go to greenhouse websites from here. So if you want to go to like Mill Creek Nursery website, there's a Cheyenne nursery, there's a local nursery, there's other ones, there's like Classic Tree Farm. Just so like going to the local nurseries, their websites, because they usually take pretty accurate pictures of what the trees actually look like. Maybe not at full maturity, but at least you kind of know. Someone else said Devonian. The Devonian Botanic Gardens are gorgeous. That's where I got married. They have a lot of these plants on display and sometimes plaques, so they tell you what they are. If not, the garden staff usually know what everything is. But also for like landscape inspiration, it can be tricky to find things that are applicable to our zone. I have a lot of clients give me like really cute Pinterest photos that don't really work with our climate. Like the materials can't handle our climate. So there's not really a good way to know that other than talking to a landscaper, unfortunately. Any tips for an old yard that needs to be completely redone? The tip would just be hire a landscape designer. I go to so many renos of people who want to like keep this little piece here and keep this little piece. It is a lot more work to like do a landscape reno, in my opinion, because you're having to like work around what's existing and keeping things safe, but also not blowing a budget. I think it's a lot easier to just like have a new build, clean slate, but I'm a designer, so I like a blank canvas. That's pretty much the comments for now. I want to do a vegetable garden. Do I first put a garden fabric on the ground to choke up the grass? If you're putting a veggie bed right on grass, you can do that. That's fine. I have mixed opinions about landscape fabric. In my opinion, because it's kind of woven, if you get 1 millimeter of quackgrass in there, it'll weave itself into the woven fabric and you'll never win. If you pull it out, if you leave just a little millimeter of quackgrass, it'll come back again. So I've heard lots of people put down like cardboard, like maybe a few layers of cardboard before putting down their veggie bed. And it kind of chokes out what's underneath. You could also just put down like really thick rock, really thick mulch, even like timber. When I did my veggie bed, I have a lot of things going on. It's called hugelkultur. So there's like logs in there and twigs and leaves and grass clippings and compost and old dead plants and different kinds of dirt and like compost. So I just make it thick enough that it just suffocates what's underneath. Not to say I'm never gonna get weeds ever again. Someone says, will hydrangeas work in zone 3? Yep. I plant a lot of hydrangeas. You do want to keep in mind that they are hardy. Sometimes greenhouses sell sort of fickle hydrangeas that are more close to zone 4. If you're trying a zone 4, I would keep it into a sheltered corner of the yard where it doesn't get direct sun, direct wind, not a lot of snow, and it just feels a little bit safer. So there are definitely hardy varieties. I plant like Annabelle, Pinky Winky, and Vanilla Strawberry a lot, and like Little Lime, Little Lamb, because I find those ones a little bit more hardy and they're still interesting. Unfortunately, the really nice hydrangeas in BC that are like purple and blue, they don't grow here. You can try, and if you get it to go, I'm super proud of you, but they really don't do very well here. Someone said, do you have a favorite pond plant? I don't know a lot about ponds, so my answer would be no. I have done yards where I'm mindful that there's like a low point in the yard, so I've planted like water plants, like swamp irises and cattails and stuff. But that's not for like a fully submerged plant. That's an area that will get quite damp, but it's not like a submerged plant. So I don't know a lot about ponds. Although there are pond landscape designers, so you could ask them. How do you get rid of quackgrass? You don't. You can't. You can't do it. There, like I have done like herbicide sprays at people's houses, not personally, but like ordered it for them, where their yard is just like at a state that I can't even try to landscape around it. And that can slow them down or deteriorate them for a moment. But quackgrass travels by seed. So if you live next to anyone ever or at any green space ever, you will get quackgrass again. And you can't win. They reproduce by this thing called rhizomes. So if you try to pull them out, you'll notice that the grass has this like long white root to it. That's what makes more. So they're almost all connected in a way. So you can never fully pull them out because their roots go on forever. And if you leave any of their roots, it'll just make more babies. So they're borderline impossible to get rid of. I haven't found a good solution. You just gotta accept they're green. Green is good. Tammy shared my email. That's the one. How to get rid of ants and keeping a maple tree. How to get rid of ants. Once again, you could go sort of the pesticide route. I took organic master gardener, so we didn't really talk a whole lot about pesticides and herbicides. We had the conversation that in like organic master gardening, that ants are natural aerators to the earth. So they keep things fluffy and loose and keep the soil from being compacted. So even though anthills are kind of annoying, overall they're doing what Earth put them here to do, which is to aerate. So as long as they're not being too bothersome to your living space, just let them do what they need to do. So that's my earthy answer. If they're bothering you, then there might be a pesticide option. And suggestions: keeping a maple tree. Maple trees can be fickle, especially ones with the large leaves. The large leaves are probably like the Norway maples, which you'd see a lot in like Ontario, or like the sugar maples. Those can be kind of fickle here. They're not super zone hardy. So I don't have a super good answer for keeping them alive if you have one of those ones, other than generous watering before it freezes in like October. I would say trying to wrap it is annoying and a lot of work, so probably not worth it. There's not a whole lot you can do. If you are thinking about planting like a large leaf maple, planting it in areas away from it would get a lot of either like the winter winds or the winter sun, because that's usually what kills a lot of plants that are like not hardy. So keeping it away from areas that like the white siding to your house or like a white fence or windows, areas where the winter sun will like reflect off of it and burn them. A lot of maple trees, they start dying at the top because they get winter kill, because they got too hot and dry, but also cold at the top. So it's kind of like a sunburn. And they kind of start dying down from there. So just once again, sheltered microclimate area where it doesn't get too much exposure to the wind or to the winter sun, which is really hard to do with a tree. Like, how do you shelter a tree? I would argue for just planting plants that want to be here. Even though I grow plants frequently that don't want to be here.
Okay, we'll just wrap things up, and then if anybody wants to stay on and ask a few more questions to Avery, we can definitely do that. But Avery, I just want to thank you for the wealth of knowledge you've shared with us this evening, how to plan and organize all your landscaping ideas with us this evening. For those attending tonight's event, this is our last event until the fall. We'll start up again back in September. If you want to follow us on Facebook and Instagram, you'll learn more about upcoming events, contests, and more. A special thank you to our Affinity Program partner, TD Milashmonics, for sponsoring tonight's event. And to continue improving our programming, we'll be sending you out a short survey tomorrow morning. So feel free to fill it out and provide us with your feedback. And again, thank you for attending.
Thank you everyone for coming. Good luck with all your landscape projects.